Hi, I'm Don James, and welcome to Portrait. My guest today is Charles Anthony Silvestri. Tony, as he's known, is a professor of medieval history and also a lyrical poet. I had the opportunity to visit with Tony and found that the things he is best known for only scratch the surface of who he really is. He is an artist, a musician, a painter, a baker. I hope you enjoy my conversation with Tony Silvestri. This is Portrait. Thank you for being with me today and taking time. I truly appreciate it.
It's my pleasure.
Was there a definitive moment that started your writing?
Yes and no, I guess. I've always been a bit of a wordsmith. Even when I was younger, I loved words and I loved reading. I read all the time. Summers for me was spent just laying on the bed reading books over and over and over again. But as a writer, it started by accident, really. My friend, the composer, Eric Whitacre, invited me to write a text for a piece of his. It was just a scholarly exercise. It was translating a brief English poem into Latin. But as a singer, I was choosing Latin words and sounds that would be more singable. There are probably better ways of translating, more literal ways of translating the poem, but they're clunky words, even in Latin. So without knowing that I was doing it, I was becoming a poet, a lyric poet, by carefully choosing words intentionally to be sung for that particular exercise. And then right off after that, Sleep and Leonardo Dreams of His Flying Machine were texts that I wrote for Eric, and then other composers began to notice, and before I knew it, I was a lyric poet.
My first introduction to your work, and probably many others, was Eric's composition Sleep. How did that text come about?
Sleep was one of these early texts. Not the first text that I wrote for Eric, but probably the second or maybe the third. I don't quite remember. But he had this particular problem, and he had created a setting of Robert Frost stopping by woods. Successful premiere, beautiful piece. It had begun to be performed, and the Robert Frost estate issued a warning to Eric that he didn't receive permission to set the text, and therefore no performances, and you can't publish the work, and so on. So the piece was effectively dead. And so that's when Eric asked me if I would like to write a text, a poem, to replace Robert Frost's Stopping by Woods, so that his setting could live. And I accepted the challenge, and I thought it was a fun exercise at the time, kind of a puzzle. There were some parts of the original poem that had to remain because of the way that Eric had said it. There were other parts of the poem that were kind of clunky in Eric's setting, and so I took it on myself to kind of correct in text the setting so that it would make more sense. And it had to end on the meditation sleep and so on. So I had a lot of constraints to my creativity, which I really like. We can talk about that more if you want. But yeah, so my career as a lyric poet started completely by accident, by saying yes to doing a favor for a friend. I find the more constraints that I give myself, or that the gig gives me, the due date, the forces that I'm writing for, the theme, and so on, the more constraints, the more quickly I can write. The more quickly I can break the hardest part, of course, is putting the first mark on the paper. The first time your brush hits the canvas. It's waiting to start is the hardest part of the creative process. And so when I have constraints, like a ticking clock or I have to write about a bell or whatever, then I can get started. And so sometimes I make constraints for myself when I'm blocked. I'll limit what I can do, and then all of a sudden things flow.
Is it easier for you to work that way, where you're setting words to music that exists already, or just coming up with your own thing and then a composer then will write the music around your words?
I would say 90% of what I do is the latter, where I come up with the poem in a vacuum and I make it as lyrical as I can, and I chant through my poetry and I sing it and I make up melodies and things just to make sure that it's lyrical. And then I pass it off onto the composer, who works then in a vacuum. That's the normal way that things work. Occasionally, I'll get the music first. Either a melody or a chord structure or a mood. There are composers that say, hey, listen to this film score and have that be the mood of the poem that you write. That sort of thing really helps me. It's one of these creative constraints. Sometimes it's a very difficult puzzle to solve. The third way, and this is the real magic way, is when the composer and I can be in the same room together, which is very rare, where the lyrics and the music come to be at the same time, and we build off of each other's creativity in the moment. Leonardo Dreams of His Flying Machine is a work like that. And it's electric, it's organic, it's magical in a way that's completely different than the other ways of putting text and music together.
One of my favorite lines that you've written comes from "When Gentle Breezes Blow." What inspired that particular piece?
That's a sonnet. And I didn't write it for any particular composer. I just wrote it as a poem for myself. I had just moved to Kansas from California, and I was in the process of continuously marveling at the weather and the skies and the thunderstorms and all these things that, as a person growing up in the West, I never really experienced. And so When Gentle Breezes Blow is a sonnet just about the wind in Kansas. And of course, a poem it can't just describe nature. It has to have some sort of deeper thing. And so I tried to imagine who the wind is and what is the wind, and does the wind have consciousness? And I sort of linked it with the will of God, the moving will of God. But that's what that poem means to me.
The line that really captured me was, "It is the engine of the sail." I don't know why, I was just drawn to those few words.
Yeah.
Very powerful.
I learned to sail in Los Angeles in a very tiny little sailboat. When you learn to sail in a small boat, every motion that you have has a direct, immediate result in what the boat is doing. And just the whole idea of a lateen sail that can use the wind direction to propel yourself even against the direction of the wind. It's just, I still can't figure out the physics of how that works. But it's just something that has fascinated me ever since that first experience in a small boat.
Yeah. Tacking, I think, is...
Tacking.
Yeah, that's the phrase. Yeah. So what was the first time that your words were put to music? And how did that feel when you heard it for the first time?
Well, it was Luxurumque and Sleep and Leonardo. There was that core of works that I wrote for Eric Whitacre. And I think the experience that I would focus on is the premiere of Leonardo Dreams of His Flying Machine. This was something that I wrote out of myself, right? With Eric's prompting and with our conversations and so on. But it was a thing we made together. And it was premiered at an ACDA national convention in San Antonio, on the very stage where I, as a chorister, had one of my most mountaintop experiences, singing at an ACDA national in college. And my choir director from college was receiving an award at that performance. And so he was backstage with me. Paul Salomonovich was with me when Leonardo was being premiered. It was thrilling, I have to say. It was thrilling to hear that piece being performed, knowing that the audience, 3,000 choir directors were in the audience, right? They know what's going on. And Eric's little quotes of Monteverdi and stuff like that were inspiring reaction, audible reaction in the crowd. And as soon as the piece was done, there was roaring applause and an instantaneous standing ovation, which is rare at an ACD National Convention. And so my first experience was that kind of mountaintop thrill that you then chase for the whole rest of your career. And I've had that. I've been able to experience and enjoy that many, many times.
Is there a piece of music that has made you cry?
I'm super sentimental, and so I cry at like Hallmark commercials. So it's very easy to make me cry. Music has this way of bunker busting all the way into your heart and your spirit. And so music has associations to time and experience. And so when I listen to music from 1980, for example, just pop music from 1980, I'm instantly transported to my bedroom. I'm just starting to play Dungeons and Dragons. And so I have graph paper out in front of me and I'm drawing castles and dungeons and stuff like that. And so I can be instantly transported to that time and space. You know, there are songs that remind you of people. There are songs that remind you of older versions of yourself. And then there are pieces of music that are written as emotional, as cathartic inspirations. The most recent one for me is Sacred Veil, which I wrote the text for Eric. And it's a piece about my wife's cancer journey and her eventual death. It took me 10 years to be able to start writing that piece. And then it took us 3 years to get through the writing of it. And then COVID hit and, there was a record. Anyway, it's had a long journey. And now that the Sacred Veil is out into the world and choirs are beginning to perform it, and there are a couple of different recordings of it out there and people are experiencing it, again, it's joyous and humbling that my words, Julie's experience, her wisdom, my catharsis, can now help other people. And so there's many layers of the weeping that happens when I listen to Sacred Veil. There's the memories of Julie and how much I loved her and how much I miss her, the anger at the pain that she endured, but then the joy that those words and that music can help others, help them grieve, help them go through their own grief journeys. Part of the ministry of Sacred Veil is taking something that was so dark, and by shining a light on it, it helps people shine the light on their own darkness. But the light that was shone on Julie's pain and on her death and on her experience and on her faith and on our love and on my grief has transformed it. There's now light coming from that darkness. And it means a lot to me. And so I'm glad you brought it up, and I'm glad that we get a chance to talk about it. It's going to be an important part of the rest of my legacy, of the whole rest of my career, the whole rest of my life. I'm going to be talking about Sacred Veil. And that's something that Eric and I talked about. He was concerned too. Are you going to be able to do this? Are you going to be able to attend the premiere? Are you going to be able to constantly return to that place? And I worried too about a future relationship. I'm literally stoking the fire of the ghost of my late wife in the midst of and so we thought about those layers. But I think every work of art that's layered like that has a kind of power.
Wow, it's powerful. It's beautiful, actually. I want to talk about other things besides just what you're probably best known for. You're a professor of medieval history, is that correct? Where did that come from? I mean, what started you on that path?
If writing lyric poetry was a mistake that just happened by accident, the teaching of history is the intentional part of my life. I remember becoming a medievalist, watching Bedknobs and Broomsticks when I was 9 or 8 years old, just being freaked out by suits of armor and, illuminated manuscripts and stuff like that. And so I've always played with doll knights, in a castle. I had this castle that opened up like this, and then I had action figures of dolls, or of knights. So I've always been obsessed with the Middle Ages as a period. And in ninth grade, I had the most dynamic, wonderful, amazing world history teacher, Mr. Avron, Clifford Avron. And my 13-year-old self just said, I want to do this. This is what I want to do for my life. His room was filled with flags and maps, and he was dynamic and interesting. And I thought, I'm going to be a world history teacher. And so I went through all my college, master's, PhD, all with the intention of being a cool high school world history teacher. And that was my first job, and I taught at a school in Los Angeles, and I loved it. I met my wife there. It was an amazing part of my career. And then when Julie died, I moved here to Kansas from California to be closer to my family because I needed their help with the kids. And luckily, I found a job at Washburn University in Topeka, where I've been teaching now for another 15 years. I've been there as long now as I was in my first job. So after 30 plus years of teaching, that's really I want to say my most powerful legacy is the thousands of students that have come through my classroom. As I've tried to be an exciting, inspiring, challenging, funny, memorable, effective educator. That's the sort of core of my working life. And now that part of my life is coming to an end. I'm getting ready to retire from teaching and devoting more full-time to my writing and my creative endeavors. And so I'm in an exciting period of transition right now.
So you're best known as a lyrical poet, but sometimes just one facet of one's life unintentionally defines us. What other passions and pursuits fulfill you?
I often think like when I'm retired, I will have time to finally X, Y, and Z. I love painting, and I love antiquarian painting. And by that I mean illuminated miniatures, like the way they did in the Middle Ages. So basically watercolor, tiny, 2x2, 3x3, tiny little paintings. I love painting icons. That's egg tempera on gessoed panel with gold leaf, using ground pigments and all that. The more antiquarian, the more historical, the better. I love oil painting. Try to imitate the old masters, that sort of thing. Rather than sort of do my own thing, I try to make copies and things in that style. So I love painting. I don't get a lot of time to do it. I'm an Irish traditional musician. I play concertina, the little tiny accordion, and I'm in a band, and I play at pub sessions here in Lawrence and around Kansas City area whenever I can. I travel with my instrument, and so I try to find sessions wherever I'm at. That's another one of my passions. I have a novel that I've started, calligraphy, all those sorts of, Renaissance-y pursuits are the things that I love to spend my time doing. And of course, nurturing relationships with friends and family and loved ones. And
You said you also enjoy time in the kitchen cooking.
I love cooking, but I especially love baking. I find that it's therapeutic, working with dough and the chemistry of it and trying to figure out how things work. And I learned to make sourdough during the pandemic, as one does, right? As we all learned some sourdough at one point. But my starter kind of worked, and I made a few Frisbees, but then the loaves started to do what they were supposed to do, and it was really good, and it saved us money, and it was fun, and it was therapeutic. So we always have fresh sourdough in the house now, and so that's just it's become part of the pattern of my life. But cakes and pies and bread and stuff, I really like that kind of stuff.
Yeah, when my wife and I were just in Italy, we went to Florence, we took a pizza and gelato making class. And
Both good things.
pizza dough, you're right, it's a chemistry
Yeah,
lesson.
yeah.
And I thought, oh, you mix it together, give it a couple, 3 hours to rise. But it really takes like literally 2 days for the yeast to do what it is supposed to do. And we learned how to actually handle the dough and how to, break down the gluten so that it's the perfect dough. It's like, who knew?
Yeah.
It was
And it's
fascinating.
also so dependent on the ambient temperature and the humidity, and what, dough in the summer is very different than dough in the winter. You have to learn the little idiosyncrasies of it. And paint is the same way. Some pigments like this medium and don't like that medium, and there are paints that like being next to each other and some that don't. And you listen to the old masters and they'll tell you how to do it and how not to make a mistake.
One of the things when we were there in Florence, I wanted to visit the Uffizi for one painting. Really, there's thousands there, but there's one that I definitely wanted to see, and that was Botticelli's La Primavera. It's a massive panel.
Yeah.
I don't know what the width is. It's probably 15 or 20 feet.
Yeah, it's bigger than you think.
Yeah. It's so vivid.
It's
the
luminous.
color is so vivid. And one of the things I learned is that tempera on wood is so much different than tempera on canvas. We saw some other canvas panels and it's like, oh, they're faded. It's like, no, it's just on a different medium.
Yeah.
But yeah, the thing I loved, yes, it has glass in front of it, but you could get probably about 6 inches close to it. And I could catch the reflection of the lighting, and you could see the individual brush strokes that were created 600, 500, over 500.
Tempera is such an interesting medium. You mix the egg yolk and a couple other things go in the egg yolk solution, and then you mix the pigment with it. And what that does is it creates the perfect emulsion of oil for the pigment to bind, but also for light to get down into and underneath the little pigment particles, so that you have light reflecting from the layers underneath. And so tempera paintings have a kind of sunlit luminousness and luminosity to them that they just glow from the inside, the way that light works on the egg yolk. And of course, then it hardens and it'll last 2,000 years. So
they're almost literally backlit.
Kind of yeah, exactly.
The colors, that's, wow. I had no idea how that worked.
On a microscopic kind of level.
Yeah. But yeah, that's what struck me, is just, you walked up to it, it's like, looks like it was painted yesterday.
Yeah. And when you go to the Uffizi, it's an interesting experience where you're like, yeah, I studied that. Oh, I wrote a research paper on that painting. Oh, that's called, and when you're seeing these things in the flesh, you have all these wow experiences. And then it's like, oh yeah, there's this. Oh yeah, the Mona Lisa, whatever. You almost lose the wowness of it, because you get, in those European museums, you get so overwhelmed by all the beauty and all of the historicity that it just gets lost. Part of the lure to me, I'm a Roman historian as well, and the Romans I understand. The Romans are very much like us. Their mentality about themselves, their view of the world, the way that they lived in and interacted in the world is very American. And so I think we as a culture are drawn to the Romans. You just go to Washington, D.C. and you can see the obsession that we have with Romanness. But the Middle Ages, that's a mystery to me. And the idea of the profound faith and the more mystical awareness of the world, I find that really fascinating and very other. And I think it's Japanese history is that way for me too. It's very other, and so I'm drawn to it because there's so much that I can learn. It's not familiar; it's foreign to me. Unfortunately, I think the Middle Ages are becoming more and more familiar as we slide as a culture into a kind of neo-feudalism. We feel more and more like serfs, serving our lords, and so there's parts of the superstition, the reactionaryism, if that's a word, that are of the Middle Ages that are starting to become much more familiar. And so what I'm trying to do is grasp onto the beauty of the Middle Ages, their art, their music, those sorts of sensibilities that I can bring into. If we're going to do neo-feudalism, then somebody's got to paint the books of hours. So that'll be me.
What is the best advice you've ever been given?
This was the hard question. Let's see. I've been given a lot of advice, of course. Some things come to mind. I remember once hearing a graduation speech by the Scottish comedian Billy Connolly. And he said to the graduates, a piece of advice, he said, "Never eat anything bigger than your head." And just in its ridiculousness, I thought, I'm never going to forget that. So there's that. My friend Eric says, and I think he's quoting from somebody else, why go with your fourth bad idea when you can just go with your first bad idea? And I think any creative person will understand that. That's really not an easy question to answer. Because I really, really struggle with how to answer your question. I can give advice, but what advice have I been given? I think my mind is just kind of a fluid of all the things and experiences that I've heard, and everything just sort of goes in and then becomes part of the potage of my experience. And so being able to identify little threads of advice that when I stir the potage, I can see little bits of things. Advice about time, advice about patience. It's an impossible question for me. I'm sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. So what is the hardest thing that you do?
What do you mean by hardest?
Well, I think you touched on it. The hardest thing is that putting that pen to paper.
Yeah.
To start.
The block in starting a creative project, whether it's starting typing a novel or priming a canvas and putting the first sketch on it. I think the reason for me that that's so difficult is the kind of imposter syndrome that I think all creative people and especially educators have, that at some point somebody's going to discover that we're a fraud and that we really don't know what we're doing. It's that risk that you take in writing a poem, in painting a painting, in performing, agreeing to do a gig. Or teach a class. I mean, I'm nervous every single time I stand in front of people. And I've stood in front of 5, I've stood in front of 50, I've stood in front of 5,000, I've stood in front of 50,000 people online. And it never gets easy. It's always a struggle. But you kind of have to, find that way to make the first mark. That's why the creative constraint comes in for me.
I remember reading a quote from Hans Zimmer when he'd just gotten an Oscar for one of his scores, and he said, "I just wish that this statue came with the first 8 bars of my next film."
Yeah, it's the first 8 bars. It's unlocking the DNA of a piece. What Eric calls the golden brick, right? The foundation stone around which everything else can be built. You just search around for it. I'm working on several major commissions this summer, and I have a trip to Ireland planned in July, and I wanted to get the bulk of this work done before I left. Here it is, first week of June, and I'm still in some ways trying to find, I'm sifting through the dirt to find the nugget that will allow me to get started. And once I have that DNA, I work relatively quickly, but I need the key in, or else I can't explore the depths of the castle. So sometimes it presents like, oh, how am I going to do that? And then it gives me something to ponder. It becomes what Sherlock Holmes would call a two-pipe problem. You just have to sort of sit and think for a while to get it. I'll get it. I always do.
Conversely, then, what's the easiest part of what you do?
Wow. The easiest part of what I do. I think as things become familiar to me, I lose some of the imposter syndrome. After 30 years of teaching world history, for example, you could say, all right, Tony, Genghis Khan, 50 minutes, go. Okay, so with no preparation, I could teach a 50-minute class on Genghis Khan, or Napoleon, or the Industrial Revolution, or the Ming Dynasty, or Sub-Saharan Africa, or, you just name it. It's just all of that familiarity of doing things over and over again. Starting an icon, I've done enough of that now that it's less scary to me. So I guess practice, habituation, teaching is easy. And I think maybe that's what the voice is telling me, it's time to retire. Once it's no longer a challenge, once you lose the nervousness about it, then maybe it's time to move on.
Where do you find beauty in the world?
Where do I find beauty in the world? There's certainly beauty in creation, in nature. My home has a lovely garden that I didn't plant. We just moved here, and the previous owners created this amazing wonderland that we're just exploring as things come up. All the different kinds of flowers and colors and things. Mountains and trees and clouds. Oh my gosh. Still, I've lived in Kansas now for 15 years, and I'm still taking photographs of the sky. 3 times a week, we see a sky that I would say before, you'd see it in a painting, you'd be like, come on, the sky never looks like that. No, it looks like that three days a week in Kansas. So the beauty of nature. When I'm traveling, I'm often photographing the works of man, right? Beautiful craftsmanship in sculpture, in architecture, in attention to detail. I like seeing other people's creativity and intention. I find beauty there. I also find beauty in what you'd call crack in Ireland, right? You go to a pub and there is music playing and people are laughing and joking, and the taste of a Guinness while you're hearing tunes being played by a fiddler, and then you sit down and you take out your instrument and you join them in a tune that you know. That kind of feeling is a really familiar and wonderful kind of joy, and I find beauty in that as well.
Where do you find inspiration in the world?
I find inspiration in the work of others, in the journeys that other creative people have taken before me. It often feels like you're wandering in the wilderness with no path, but you look a little harder. No, there's some footprints that you can follow. In painting, in music, in writing, there are others that do this. There are others that have done it, and follow them. Study the score, read poetry, look at painting, look really closely at painting, listen to music differently. Don't just consume, listen. Oftentimes I can find the inspiration that I need when I just ask the universe around me to provide that inspiration. I'm so blessed. I'm so blessed. My life has been complex. It's been unexpected. If you showed me my life right now, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, I just wouldn't believe it. There's no way that I'd believe that I could live in this home, that I could have the partner that I have, that my kids have grown up and are thriving, that I live in Kansas, that I have a career as a creative person. I just never would have believed it, ever, ever, ever. And so I'm constantly marveling at the wonder of my life. And I look forward to the second act, or maybe third act. I don't know how how one's lifetime goes. I like to think maybe second act, second of three. So we'll see.